Welcome everyone to this evidence-based mental health live YouTube Hangout. Today we'll be discussing, as many of you know, this recent publication by Andrea Cipriani and his colleagues looking at the comparative efficacy and acceptability of 21 antidepressant drugs for acute treatment of adults with major depressive disorder. It was a massive undertaking with a huge amount of data that took many years to compile and analyze, and we're grateful to have him here. We're joined by several guests, including Benoit Mulsant, who is professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry and the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. My time in Paris ruined me. We're also joined by Roy Perlis, who's a professor at Harvard Medical School. He's Associate Vice Chair for Translational Medicine in the department there and the Director for the Center for Quantitative Health at Mass General Hospital. And we're also joined by one of the co-authors of the paper, Erick Turner, who's an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Oregon Health and Science University. Dr. Turner's work is really relevant to this discussion. It's been aimed at increasing medical research transparency to make the evidence base more complete, truthful, and reliable, and has been a critic of hidden data. He worked at NIMH in the intramural branch and then moved to the FDA, where he learned a lot about how drugs are approved. He's now in Oregon, and we're glad to have all of our guests today. I'm Michael Ostacher. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, and will be helping facilitate this discussion. If you would like to follow us on Twitter, please do so using the hashtag EBMHchat. That's hashtag EBMHchat. We'll try to entertain as many of your questions as we can live and ask our discussants to answer them. It would be helpful too if our speakers, if you're not speaking now, to mute. Andrea will be presenting some slides from the paper, and so it would be helpful to have us muted for him to do that. Andrea, would you like to go ahead and
yes. Thank you, Michael. I tried to share my screen and see whether, can you see the slides?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. So I'll try to summarize the main methods and results of our Lancet publication. And but before I start presenting the methods, I'd like to spend just a few words about the methodology itself, because natural meta-analysis is very popular today, but there's a lot of so-called not high quality publications in terms of natural meta-analysis in the literature. So I think it's important to spend a few words about how it works. So let's say we have a network of treatments, and usually what we have when we summarize a large amount of evidence is that we have participants to the studies and individual studies. So this is a graphical representation of a network of treatments, and you can see that, for instance, for some drugs, we have a large node, and this is proportional to the number of patients randomized to the drug. A lot of patients randomized to fluoxetine, not so many to duloxetine, and the width of the line is proportional to the number of studies comparing two drugs. So, for instance, we have a lot of studies comparing sertraline with fluoxetine, but we don't have any studies comparing reboxetine with mirtazapine. So what we can do in this network is to compare drugs or interventions which are not directly compared using a common comparator. So we can calculate the indirect evidence reboxetine versus mirtazapine going via, for instance, fluoxetine, which is a common comparator because we have trials reboxetine, fluoxetine, and we have trials fluoxetine, mirtazapine. So one of the great advantages of natural meta-analysis is to fill the gaps in the information. But what I think is even more important from a statistical and methodological point of view is the following. We have many studies comparing sertraline versus fluoxetine, so we have direct evidence comparing the two drugs, but we can use the network of treatments to calculate also the indirect evidence sertraline fluoxetine via a common comparator. So we can calculate this indirect evidence via venlafaxine, because we have sertraline, venlafaxine, fluoxetine. And the great thing is that we can calculate this indirect evidence using the whole network of treatments and studies. So we can calculate the indirect evidence sertraline fluoxetine also via citalopram, via fluvoxamine, via any of the closed loops within the network. And the most important thing of this is that we have direct data plus indirect data, and we can compare the two, and we can check what is a key issue in network meta-analysis, which is the so-called consistency, because we would like to have the direct evidence and the indirect evidence to be consistent, so basically saying the same things. So just to summarize in a few bullet points, which are the advantages of NMAs, network meta-analysis. As I said, we can compare interventions which haven't been compared directly in any trial. We can have a comprehensive use of all available evidence, combining direct and indirect evidence. We can improve the precision of the comparisons, and we can also rank the treatments for the same condition. Okay, about the Lancet paper. Actually, we started almost 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, when we published the first network meta-analysis in psychiatry. And at that time, we wanted to answer a specific question. At that time, I was finishing my residency in psychiatry. And I remember one of the questions I had for my mentor and supervisor was, which antidepressant to prescribe to the patient? Because if you look at the literature, there were many meta-analyses saying that antidepressants were basically the same and there were no differences between antidepressants. So the question was, I have a patient in front of me with major depression, let's say moderate to severe major depression. I decided to prescribe an antidepressant, which is, if any, the best treatment to prescribe to this patient. And what we did was to collect all available head-to-head trials comparing the new generation antidepressants, because at that time the guidelines suggested for patients with major depression to start with an SSRI or newer drugs. And what we found was that there were some differences between active treatments, and we gathered a lot of information about major depression and pharmacological treatment of major depression. And we decided to focus on pharmacological treatment because we all know that also psychological treatments are effective for major depression, but antidepressants are widely used across the world. So this is why we decided to focus only on this treatment. But after the publication, there were some concerns about the publication. The first one was that basically we decided to focus on active treatments, neglecting the issue about placebo and all the placebo-controlled trials, which is the majority of studies in the field. I can remember a letter published in the Lancet by Erick, so I'm very happy Erick is here now to share this experience. And also the other problem is that if you start ranking the treatment, we have different rankings. Everybody was saying different things, different interpretation. So the issue, how statistically significant differences can translate into something which is clinically significant. So there were other publications in the Annals Journal, Annals of Internal Medicine, other scientific journals. And I remember that John Ioannidis, again, wrote a letter to the Lancet highlighting this issue. So after the first project, which was called MANGA, Meta-Analysis of New Generation Antidepressant, 2009, we then decided to update and expand this project with Griselda. group of researchers investigating specific efficacy of individual drugs for acute depression. So names are very important. And when I decided to call this project Griselda, well, I had in mind the figure of this fantastic woman. It's a fantastic story of obedience and patience, because I knew that it was a difficult project in terms of time, collecting all the data, but also one of the key issues, I think, was to have a group of researchers that were really interested in providing evidence to help clinical practice. And the effort I made was to have the best people in the field, including clinicians, methodologists, biostatisticians, to work together on a large database and agree on the final message to be published in the paper. So in MANGA, we had only active drugs, no placebo. We didn't include all the comparators, only the second generation antidepressants. We looked only at two outcomes, response rate and dropout rate. Of course, it was acute depression, so outcomes were at 8 weeks of treatment, 12 drugs, 117 randomized controlled trials, not all double-blind, and 26,000 participants. Griselda, 6 years of work. We included placebo. We included also dichotomous outcomes and also other outcomes like dropouts due to adverse events or remission. We wanted to be informative across the world, so we included not only the newest antidepressants, but also the older antidepressants, tricyclics included in the WHO essential list of medicine, trazodone, nefazodone, and other old drugs. An added value was the search strategy. We had Erick on board because his expertise in retrieving data from the regulatory agencies and the issue about placebo. So extensive search of all available data, as we did our best to retrieve what we could. And we ended up with 21 drugs plus placebo, 522 only double-blind randomized controlled trial, and less than 120,000 participants. So the rationale was, we know antidepressants are one of the possible treatments tool we have for depression, but they are widely used worldwide. So can we say something about the long-lasting debate about their efficacy, so the comparison versus placebo, and again, check whether there are differences between individual drugs, because it's not a given. It's something that we need to assess if applicable. So the focus, again, because it's a systematic review, so we have to be specific in what we address, was investigating the acute effect of pharmacological treatments, antidepressants, for adults with unipolar major depressive disorder. And as I said, we wanted to compare many drugs, not only the newest antidepressants. Of course, we have placebo, so we included only double-blind randomized controlled trial, either published or non-published, antidepressant as monotherapy, oral monotherapy, adults with a primary diagnosis of major depressive disorders diagnosed with a standardized operationalized criteria. The search was until 2016 because, and we published the paper only this year because it took us almost 2 years to analyze the data and develop the methodology. We searched international trial registries, websites, pharmaceutical companies, scientific journals, and we also contacted the authors. This is the list of 21 drugs plus placebo. Of course, in order to preserve the transitivity across the network and the clinical interpretation of the results, we excluded bipolar disorder, psychotic patients or treatment-resistant depression, of course, also the comorbidity with concomitant medical illness. As I said, we look at response and all-cause dropout to be consistent with the 2009 Lancet paper, but we added 3 secondary outcomes. And of course, the drugs were used and the data gathered only within the therapeutic range.
Andrea, it's Roy. Before you go on to the next slide, I'm curious, there's often a sense in the field and certainly among lay audiences that there's this abundance of failed studies or negative studies that have been hidden. And you've alluded to this a few times about how hard you worked to unearth these other studies and make sure you could get their data. I'm curious if the extent to which, first of all, how much did you find? And then second, how much did it impact your results?
Yeah, this is something I'd like also Erick to chip in, because this is something I learned from Erick. So what we did was to look at the regulatory agencies. For instance, the FDA posted a lot of information in the website about all the trials submitted to the FDA for the regulatory approval. And of course, we included all the eligible studies. So we did not select only the positive studies. We also look at other regulatory agencies, Japan, Australia, Europe. We look at the now many companies, not all the companies, but many companies have registries where they post the unpublished data of the published studies. So if we found a study published, but we also managed to have unpublished data, and there was a difference between the two, we gave preference to the unpublished data. I don't know, Erick, do you want to add something about Roy's comment?
I would agree with everything you said. That it's odd that I've seen some editorials about your Lancet paper criticizing it for not taking into account the issue of a lot of trials are not published, when in fact an extensive effort was taken. I think it was perhaps the person putting forth that criticism, or the people putting forth that criticism, didn't carefully read the methods. And I think I saw something like that on Twitter and said, well, look, and here's the section from the paper that documents that. So I actually feel that people who would criticize your paper, but then they would compliment the paper that I had led in 2008, is where we looked at the FDA and unearthed a bunch of a large number of unpublished studies and contrasted them with the published version of the same sets of clinical trials. But the reality is that you have actually gone well above and beyond what we had done by looking not only at FDA data, but bringing in these other regulatory agencies. I'll just clarify the one key difference between our methodologies is that in the papers that I've been involved in, we tend to keep separate the FDA data and the published data, and so there's a pair of meta-analyses, whereas in your case, it's been combined into a single meta-analysis. So just that could be a point of confusion for some people.
Thank you, Erick. And Roy, I will answer the question about how much unpublished information is included when I show the flow diagram in a second. So I can provide you with exact numbers. So the statistical analysis is a tribute to the statisticians in the project, because Georgia Salanti led the analysis, but we also have Anna Chaimani, we have Julian Higgins on board, so Matthias Egger, so the best people in the world in terms of evidence synthesis for network meta-analysis, and everything was pre-specified in the protocol that we published in BMJ Open. And we tried also not only to carry out the primary analysis, but also to look at potential effect modifiers, and also we performed a statistical evaluation of the consistency of the network, as I explained before. And we are also very proud to say that the statisticians analyze independently the data set with different softwares, just to be sure that everything was in agreement. And everything is posted in the appendix of the paper, which is open access, so everything is available. And to assess the quality, so to speak, of the evidence, we use GRADE. These are the subgroup analysis. It's a lot of analysis, and I will move to the next slide just to show you the flow diagram of the information. So we started from the records identified through the database searching, but we also had hunt searches and personal communications. We look at the unpublished data. So in the end, Roy, we managed to include 86 completely unpublished studies. But as I said, we had a lot of information for the published studies, which was unpublished, and we gave preference to this information. And this is the detailed representation of what we included in this analysis. These two figures, the networks, I think they are important for two reasons. One is to show on the left side is the network for efficacy, and on the right side is the network for acceptability, the two primary outcomes. So the first thing is to show, is to say, is that the network is pretty well connected, which means we can check inconsistency, which means results are pretty robust from a statistical point of view. The second thing is that, well, the huge amount of evidence about placebo, so it's a very important network, and almost all the drugs are connected to placebo. The only exception is clomipramine. We don't have studies reporting efficacy data, clomipramine versus placebo. They report data only about acceptability. But the other thing from a methodological point of view, which is interesting, is that the two networks are very, very similar, which means that the information we can derive about efficacy can be also applied to acceptability, because we are talking about the same number of studies. So the same population providing efficacy data and acceptability data. So these are the results comparing all the drugs versus placebo. As I said, 8-week outcomes, and efficacy was 50% reduction on a rating scale. And we reported the details about how we measure it in the protocol published in BMJ Open. As you can see, all the drugs are more efficacious than placebo, because all the drugs are on the right. These are averages, of course. So this doesn't mean that all the patients allocated to a drug are better than placebo, but on average, the drugs are more efficacious than placebo, and how much they are efficacious differ a bit across the different drugs. In terms of acceptability, basically we don't have any difference between drugs and placebo, with a few exceptions. Agomelatine and fluoxetine apparently slightly better than placebo, but you can see that the confidence interval are pretty close to no difference, and the same for clomipramine, which is statistically significantly worse than placebo in terms of acceptability, but you can see that the confidence interval is pretty broad. This is interesting. This is, I think, an interesting finding that may have implication for the future, and it would be nice to discuss it now. So this is a graphical representation of the different drugs with different numbers, combining efficacy and acceptability. You can see 22 is placebo, and these are the active drugs. 16 is reboxetine, because it's the least effective drug, so it's good to have reboxetine as a reference drug. And what is interesting is that if you plot this data, including placebo, these are the differences between the drugs. But if you exclude placebo-controlled trials, these are the differences between drugs. So it looks like having placebo shrinks the differences, or the other way around, not having placebo overinflates the differences between drugs. So this is a point I will leave for discussion, but this information about the head-to-head studies is also reported in this league table, where we have all the drugs in alphabetical order. The bottom left side is comparing efficacy. The top right is about acceptability. And how to read this table, you have the column defining drug versus the row defining drug. So this is the estimate agomelatine versus bupropion. This is the estimate clomipramine versus nefazodone, and so on. And it's symmetrical. So clomipramine versus nefazodone is here for efficacy, and we have clomipramine versus nefazodone here as acceptability. Highlighted and bold are statistically significant results. So we have some statistically significant results, especially for some drugs. Other are typically less effective. And likewise, for acceptability, we have statistically significant differences. More to come, I think, during the discussion. So just to summarize, the results of the secondary outcomes were in line with the findings from the primary outcome, and also the sensitivity as a subgroup analysis didn't change materially the results. This is an interesting finding. This is an analysis we added because discussing with John Ioannidis, who's part of the review team, he wanted to assess whether having a novel treatment versus an old treatment can change the results, and this is what we found. So within the head-to-head comparison, when a treatment was the novel or the experimental drug, it appeared to be significantly more effective than when the same treatment was the older or the control drug. So, and the difference is small, but it is statistically significant. We adjusted for the novelty effect, and this diminished the differences between the antidepressants. So this is another thing to take into account. The last result is about the quality or certainty of evidence. We have some drugs with moderate quality of evidence, some drugs with low or very low quality of evidence. Of course, according to the protocol, we've been very tough in assessing quality because we know from Erick 2008 paper that the quality of the antidepressant trial is very debatable. So this is what we found. I finish with the limitation because this analysis has a lot of limitation, of course, but still it is the best evidence we have to inform treatment decision about antidepressants for acute depression. So this is the main limitation is about quality, as I said. Of course, we did not perform any formal cost-effectiveness analysis, so we need to translate this result into what is meaningful for the healthcare system. However, we included the WHO drugs, so we would like to inform policy across the world, and the great majority of antidepressants are in a generic form, so we do not expect huge differences for the great majority of drugs. There are a few exceptions, of course, because we have newly marketed drugs. This is very important, I think, considering all the controversy in the media. We analyze the average effect of the treatment, so it's difficult to translate this into the individual effect, and this is the challenge we are facing now, so moving from the average aggregate data to the individual patient data, where we can address a lot of issues about effect modifiers like age, sex, severity of illness, and blah, blah, blah. Of course, the patients are highly selected as patients for all the randomized trials, and we excluded patients with psychotic and treatment-resistant depression, so these results do not translate automatically to all the patients we see in our clinic. We did not cover important clinical issues, for instance, specific adverse events, because this is the project we are doing now, withdrawal symptoms, and all the other things that should corroborate the clinical decision process. Of course, we were not able to investigate very important outcome for patients and carers like the global functioning, but this is the limitation of the primary data. Of course, again, looking at the acute evidence, we know that adverse events come out over a long, prolonged period of time, so this information should be contextualized to the 8-week data. And we think that this information from the Lancet paper should inform the initial treatment. And having modest effect sizes, we expect people who do not respond to antidepressant or they have nasty adverse events. Unfortunately, this is common to all treatments. And we incorporated a lot of unpublished data, but we are aware we are missing some studies. We are aware this is the best we could do, but it's not the whole amount available data outside in the world because we may have missed something. Thank you.
That's great. That's terrific, Andrea. If everybody can bring their video back and unmute themselves, that would be terrific. So that is very comprehensive and helpful review of the paper, Andrea. You published also last week a commentary in Lancet Psychiatry addressing some of the issues that have come up just in the short time since your paper was first published online, and publicized. Do you have any comments about, or would you like to tell us about some of the biggest issues that came up for discussion that were meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think the editorial was a way we wanted to use to clarify a few things about the implication of these findings, because one thing is the debate in the scientific literature, in the media, in the social media, and this is one thing, but the other thing is what we can do now to move on and try to improve treatment for our patients, because as I said, this is a very specific question. We need to have better treatment for our patient. We need to have access to the individual patient data. And also we wanted to highlight the importance of fighting stigma in mental health, because having an effective treatment like a drug that works is important for people who are taking medication who do not, they should not feel stigmatized for this. But I'd like to know what the other experts in the panel think about the results and the implication of the studies, or if they have any comments.
Let me start with a mechanistic question. In online discussions, one of the comments I saw the most was, well, yes, but what about this other meta-analysis, right? There's this other meta-analysis that said they were no better than placebo, or they were no better than placebo in mild to moderate depression. Now, obviously, what y'all did was extremely comprehensive. But I'm curious, can you simulate, so I think in the consort diagram, there were 35 studies where you couldn't get data. So how negative would those studies have to be, those hidden studies have to be to eliminate your result? How much sort of hidden negative data would you know, tell me about the dark matter in the antidepressant universe. Is it plausible that your results would be different if everything were known?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I'd like Erick to chip in. What we found, and again, everything is open to everybody, is that yes, the dark materials are there definitely, and we know that companies have a track record in trying to hide data or manipulate. So not all the companies, not all the authors, but this happened in the past. What we found, interestingly, is that all the initiatives, like the All Trials Initiative, having the clinicaltrials.gov, having access to FDA data, now we have a lot of information about the newest drugs, and the big question mark is more about the older drugs. I don't know what you think, Erick, about this.
Well, I wanted to comment on the meta-analyses that say that there is no difference from placebo. And I think we have to get into the weeds a little bit on the issue of statistical versus clinical significance, because I think the people that have the researchers who have made that, who have drawn that conclusion, have drawn it not on the basis of statistically significant differences, which I think are undebatable. I think that there clearly are statistically significant differences versus placebo for almost all these drugs. I think reboxetine might be one exception. But then the clinical significance is a bit of a judgment call on the part of the researcher. What is, some researcher might choose a certain effect size value as being a cutoff for, this is what I'm going to call clinically significant. And you can set the bar. There's no evidence-based, or the field has not reached consensus on how these numbers should be arrived at. And so that's how the conclusion, and to my knowledge, has been reached. That there was a certain threshold that was set, and that threshold wasn't reached. But you have to wonder, well, is that threshold reached for other therapies or for any therapy, such as psychotherapy? And actually, if you compare it with, psychotherapy would also fail the test, as would many other classes of medications. So hope that's not getting a bit too much into the weeds, but I think that the question is different. To say there's no difference from placebo, well, what do you mean by that? Is it, anyway?
Yeah, I assume, Roy, you were talking about essentially the Kirsch meta-analysis that suggests, among others,
that seems to be the one that gets cited the most often.
Right. So, I mean, Erick, you can speak.
It's important. I mean, I think it's important to understand. It's an important distinction for us to make, right, between statistical and clinical significance. I guess what I wonder is if our friends from NICE were here, from the NICE guidelines, they seem to have a pretty clear-cut idea on rating scales of what's clinically significant, right?
Seems to me they backed off on that. I think there were some NICE guidelines in 2004, I believe, where they suggested a standardized mean difference of 0.5, a Cohen's D or Hedges G of 0.5. A standard deviation was how they suggested that would be a threshold for clinical significance. And there was also a suggestion of 3 points on the HAM-D as being a difference between drug and placebo. They never gave any citation as to where that came from, where the 0.5 came from, or where the 3 points on the HAM-D came from. It seems to have come from, as best I can tell, from Jacob Cohen himself, who wrote about effect sizes and said that 0.5 was a medium effect. 0.2 he called a small effect. 0.8 he called a large effect. But then if you actually go into his book where he lays out those numbers, he was saying these are arbitrary and based on my own intuition. And the kinds of things that Jacob Cohen was talking about, I had in mind at the time, were not clinical trials. It was not clinical significance. He was talking about, I think, he said a medium effect should be visible to the naked eye. And I think some of the examples had to do with the height of 7th graders versus the height of 6th graders. Well, that's visible to the naked eye. So anyway, that somehow got spun into, it took on a life of its own. Jacob Cohen's 0.5 became the NICE 0.5 threshold for clinical significance. Then Irving Kirsch used it with his group in his paper as a threshold, and lo and behold, antidepressants failed the test, again, as would psychotherapy, but that's not mentioned.
I recall that Michael Face had protested that what NICE and Kirsch were doing was just finding the mean difference between drug and placebo amongst all antidepressants and calling that point, that is, all drugs that were above the mean difference for all trials, significant, and all those below not significant. And I can understand that NICE has an interest in cost as well as efficacy when they're making their guidelines. And so I wonder if that had an effect. Benoit, you have a comment.
Yeah, I want to go back to what Andrea said initially. The goal of his work and his paper was to help clinicians who are facing patients. And at the end, so when we look at this new paper, to me, there are 3 kind of high-level conclusions. The first one is despite all the debate, when we look at the entirety of data, 500 plus trial, 120,000 patients, we have a statistical significant finding. Antidepressant will beat placebo. And you can always do some more selective analysis, but this is probably going to be the best data set that we have. I doubt somebody else will redo this one. So I think this one is done. There are almost nobody serious in the field who believe that overall antidepressants do not beat placebo statistically. The second issue, the issue of the clinical significance, I want to echo what Erick said. Physician, primary care, family doctor, psychiatrist do not prescribe placebo. They prescribe antidepressant or they decide not to prescribe antidepressant. And what those data show, when you look at the effect size, you could always argue if it's significant enough, if we need better drug. But the current antidepressant that we have are probably as good on average as drugs that are used by physicians to treat other conditions. They are except for antibiotics. And there are other papers that have shown that the effect size of antidepressants are as good as what we use to treat chronic pain, high blood pressure, so peptic ulcer disease. So I don't think we need to be bothered by that. The last point is and was very clearly made by the authors, of which I'm not one of them, in their conclusion, is the effect size is there. It is probably clinically significant for most patients, but it's modest. We do need better treatment. And I think what Dr. Cipriani said is the next step is if you throw a drug at 300 patients and you help about 120 of them, and somehow help a little bit, somehow help a lot, we need new method to be able to, instead of that kind of trial and error approach, to be able to say, are there a group of patients that we can predict will benefit more and who clearly should be tried on that medication, and a group of patients where the likelihood of benefiting is so small or the benefits are going so small that we need to try something else.
So you're saying that we should find a way to know from the patient's perspective themselves whether or not a drug will work for them, not just from the data.
Well, that's a different issue. In the end, that's where we are stuck today, is the trial and error. We try a medication in a patient. If over the next 2 to 3 months they get better and they feel good, it may be a placebo effect, but usually they should continue the drug. If it doesn't work or they have bad side effects, it should be stopped. That's where we are. But what Dr. Cipriani mentioned is that with those massive data, we hope to do better, and within the next 5 to 10 years to be able prospectively to say to a patient, this drug should work for you and this one should probably not work for you, where for now we have no way to do this.
Andrea, actually, to that point, what conclusions can you draw from your data about which antidepressants are better than others? Or is it, because I know that the top line popular press data basically said, the top line headlines were, all antidepressants work.
Which,
but
Michael,
that's really not what clinicians want to hear.
Can I just underscore, though, think about what that says about 40 years of drug discovery efforts, right? That 30 years after fluoxetine, on average, the first line drugs we have to prescribe are really no better than fluoxetine. So I want to hear what Andrea has to say as well. But we should pause and recognize we've got 30 years in and we haven't done much better than fluoxetine.
Well, actually, Andrea, from an acceptability perspective, we may have done worse, right? And so that's one of the surprise findings from your study, is that even compared to placebo, there's better acceptability for fluoxetine. So I have 2 questions. One is, does that mean that we should be prescribing fluoxetine to everyone? And second, how do you account for that difference? Do you think there's something about the studies themselves that led to people being more likely to find the drug acceptable compared to placebo?
A very difficult question. Well, I think that the data and the results should inform the shared decision process. And I agree with many people who wrote in newspapers and media and also scientific papers that this is only part of the whole picture. Looking at efficacy or acceptability at 8 weeks cannot inform completely. But it's a working process. At least it's good to start with here. And in my clinical practice, yes, I don't think that all antidepressants are created equal. I have, in my mind, a group of treatments which are clearly, or to me, or probably for other people, less effective, which is the most important thing, not to prescribe patients something which is unlikely to work. And I agree with Benoit that we should mutate from the other fields of medicine, the approach. So if we have a risk in terms of responding, this is what I discuss with my patients, trying to make it an informed decision. But I totally agree with Roy, because yes, there are 2 issues. One is we have a huge amount of data. And as a clinician, I'd like to use this data now to inform the decision. So these are aggregate data. I think they're useful. We need to go down to the individual patient level. What we just published in the BMJ is, for instance, a way to make network meta-analysis a living thing, so continuously updated. We are developing also the methodology to identify the component of specific things. So there's a lot to do with the data, but at the same time, the bottom line message is we need better treatment. We need to improve innovation in psychiatry. And at the same time, the aim is to generate a sort of platform where we have all the different data coming together. So we have clinical data, genetic data, we have all the other things that should be lumped together and guide the decision-making process.
Other comments, Erick? You have to mute yourself, I think.
Thank you. Okay, you hear me now?
Yeah.
I want to echo Benoit's comment about the other indications, and we get back to this topic of clinical significance. There have been some articles. I'm thinking of one in particular by Helena Kramer of Stanford, which is down your way, Michael. She's a statistician. Wrote about the critical issue of clinical significance being a function of which indication you're talking about. That we need to. You can't. Getting back to the idea of this 0.5 standard deviation as being a threshold for clinical significance, which NICE was using in 2004, but by the way, they seemed to drop it in their later iteration. It didn't appear anywhere about that. But she talked about, even if you accepted, even if you thought that 0.5 could be a threshold for clinical significance, well, surely that doesn't apply. It's not a one-size-fits-all that to be applied to vaccines, to cancer drugs, to antihypertensives, to you name it. It has to vary, has to depend upon the situation that you're talking about. And by the way, the effect size that you would get for cancer drugs, the incremental benefit over control comparisons is very small compared to with antidepressants. So would that mean that we should, all chemotherapy should stop? I submit not. So anyway, that's perhaps a bit off the topic. I don't know, but hope that makes some sense.
I think one of the points that has been mentioned a few times, but we probably should underscore, is how important it is to recognize that these are population averages. Because I've seen a lot of discussion sort of purporting to rebut the Lancet paper that starts out with, well, I took Prozac and I actually felt worse. And that's balanced with, well, I don't know what they're talking about. I started Prozac and I felt much better and it changed my life. And
right.
That's a hard concept to convey, I think, to an individual when you're sitting with them, that we have these studies that say on average, someone will get a little bit better on this scale. But some people will get a lot better and a few people will get worse. And the reason that I raise that is I really rarely come across someone who says, okay, so on average, I'm only going to get a little bit better. Well, then I don't really want to try this. Particularly because in that context, what's the alternative? I mean, certainly we have psychosocial interventions and those are important and we should probably talk about those. But I think as far as medications go, when people are open to taking a medication, again, I rarely hear from someone, that's not good enough. That's not enough. I don't like my chances enough. So population summaries.
Well, Andre, yeah.
Have you guys heard the joke about the statistician?
Yeah.
This is brief. The one that he's got one foot in boiling oil and the other foot in liquid nitrogen. He says, on average, I feel just right.
Well, I mean, this is maybe a time to bring up Andre Tomlin's from the mental health question about individual patient level data, which is what needs to be done in terms of the carrot and stick to speed up the production of individual patient data, network meta-analyses, and antidepressants. Is that something, Andrea, that you could address?
Yes, of course. Things have changed. Now we can have access to the individual patient data, not for all the individual patient data of studies, but it's much easier because study authors and drug companies and regulatory agencies are contributing and collaborating. There are some legal issues, and there are other problems about the protection of the data and anonymity. The big problem is that even if it's true that in principle it's possible, it's very difficult to do, it's very time consuming. And also we tend to point the finger against the companies that when we do a study, sometimes we are very jealous about our data. So the sharing culture should completely change. We need to be open to the open science world.
Yeah.
This is why I wanted to publish the data and make them available. Sorry?
Roy, do you have a comment about sort of how we can get moving in that direction? Because I think that's an essential piece here. Ben Goldacre has written about it. Others have written about it. I mean, clearly, the Andrea, your editorial in Lancet Psychiatry last week touches on it. How do we get to a place where we have free access to all the data, so that whatever analyses can be done will be enabled in that way? Roy, do you have?
Yeah. So I mean, I would take the genomic data as a starting point, just because it's what I know the best. And I think for a long time, the pharmas were very concerned about the genomic data and about sharing the genomic data for two reasons. The first was that if they identified something that was predictive of poor response or side effects, that FDA would require them to include it in their label. So I think there was a certain amount of, be careful what you wish for. I think the larger concern was, right now, any patient is a potential customer for this new product. And if we start identifying differentially responsive groups, we're going to fragment our market. So instead of everyone being a potential fluoxetine patient, now only 10% are potential fluoxetine patients. And I and many others pointed out to them that, wouldn't you rather have, that 10% for sure than a small chance at the 100%? And I do think in recent years they've become more flexible, and I know there's a lot more effort going on to share data. I think a lot of it was also driven by human subjects concerns. When a lot of these studies were done, the consents didn't allow sharing of data. But I think the field is moving in the direction of more sharing and greater transparency. I think you also have to recognize that if we've learned anything in psychiatric genetics, we've learned that that these are incredibly complex phenotypes, and so you really do need large numbers of participants, much larger than in your typical clinical trial, to find robust effects. But I think that the good news is we're moving in a direction of greater transparency.
Andrea, were you going to say something about this, or Benoit, did you have a point you wanted to bring in?
I wanted to echo what Roy said earlier. The patient, again, the perspective of a clinician, the patient are not interested to be told, on average, your depression score will decrease by 3 points. What happened in reality is they are and the same thing with chemotherapy, or patients are not told, well, 20% will have a cure, 80% will live, and therefore the survival is 0.6. No, they take the drug and they either get a cure from their cancer or they die. And antidepressant, they take the drug and either they get better and then they are motivated to continue, or they don't, and they should stop, and the clinician should stop the medication. medication and try something else. And somebody mentioned that polarization, when you look at the psychosocial intervention, be it psychotherapy or exercise or other form of less conventional therapy, there is not a lot of difference in the end between any of those treatments for depression. There's not a lot of difference with placebo, but there's not a lot of difference as a first-line treatment between psychotherapy. And at the end, Andrea mentioned it, it's become a question of patient preference, patient value, what's available to them. And the bottom line, in the end, I think, to go back to Cipriani paper, that Lancet paper, it will be a landmark. It hopefully is the end of some debate, and we can move towards something more interesting and for the future for patients. And the sharing of data, just one asterisk, any trial funded by US taxpayers through the National Institute of Health or PCORI or other taxpayer funded, those data have to be made available to researchers at the end. So I think we're in a new era of research, and it will be way easier for people like Andrea in 5 to 10 years to do research at the patient level.
I totally agree with that. I think it's really interesting that we're relying on for-profit entities to do clinically relevant research when it's not necessarily, as Roy pointed out, they don't know whether or not it's in their interest to do so, because their goal is to maximize their marketplace penetration, and it's very difficult. Andre Tomlins again asked a question from the mental health about this, and I think it's relevant to what you were talking about, Benoit, which is given that we have this information, how much of this ends up being used for shared decision making amongst patients and prescribers. I mean, how is this information that we have now, Andrea, from your paper, how is it going to impact things? Is it going to change what the guidelines are currently recommending, or is it just going to support what they're already recommending?
I think this information should inform guidelines because worldwide guidelines, not only in the developed world, and especially because we tend to focus on the winner is, but at least we have some drugs that are less likely to be the best treatment, but they are in some guidelines, they are available somewhere. So to inform clinicians, especially GPs, because this is more for primary care than for secondary care, I think should be important for clinical guidelines.
I tried to press you on this earlier, and I will try to do so again. Is there anything from your results that would lead you to say that one drug should be chosen over another first line? Or do you have a group of drugs first line? Or do you even care as a clinician, which I know you are, to comment about where you start with antidepressants with patients?
Yeah, there are a group of drugs I would start discussing with the patients, and some drugs in this network that I would not, definitely would not mention at the beginning. I know I'm aware of time. I wanted to ask a comment, to ask something based on a comment, because we are talking about open data, we are talking about need for new, better treatments. Another thing that was striking to me from this paper came out when I went to a meeting here in Oxford, and we had people from all across the world, from people from the US, from the Scandinavian countries, Norway. And the US people were commenting about Facebook and the data, stealing the data, commercial things and other problems about Facebook. And I was amazed because the colleague from Norway said, well, it's impossible here because they have these huge national registries, and they say, we trust the government. We know it cannot be for profit because they trust. And this is a big challenge for us as psychiatrists, trying to increase the trust people have on what we do, because we want to improve the outcome of our patients. We are doing our best, and we need to be trusted in what we do.
Any final comments before we need to end this? Benoit, Erick, Roy? I just want to I just, go ahead.
Yeah, I think first we need to thank people like Andrea and his team.
Yes, absolutely.
2 years of analysis, 5 years to gather the data, and the fact that people say we wish it would have been more this or more that, it's still a landmark, and it will remain a landmark in antidepressant studies.
I completely agree. And I do want to, yes, and I think I mentioned this when I introduced this talk. This is a huge amount of work that Andrea mentioned himself began more than a decade ago. But this paper itself took 5 years of data collection and a lot of work on your part, Eric, and on others to try to do this. I also want to acknowledge that since we're essentially out of time, that this is really about a short-term view of whether or not antidepressants work, and cannot and does not answer any questions about the long-term use of treatment, at least from the data themselves. Eric, you had a comment you wanted to make before we sign off.
No, I mean, I was just going to comment on the transparency topic. That there's been tremendous strides actually over the past 10 years. I would say if you were to look at the number of papers that have to do with increasing transparency, it would be, I think it would be mind-boggling. There's a much more attention to that. The NIH policy recently, where people who get NIH money have to post their results on clinicaltrials.gov or have their funding yanked in the future. FDA is now doing a pilot where they're going to be putting the clinical, at least for one drug company, but more are coming, supposedly, with their full clinical study reports will be put online. In other words, the patient level data will be available. These things were not being discussed at all 10 years ago. So that's my only comment.
Well, I wish we could go on. We're out of time. I do want to wrap up. I want to thank all our participants. Benoit Mulsant, who's professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatry in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Roy Perlis, who's professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and an old friend. Erick Turner, associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Oregon Health and Science University. Of course, Andrea Cipriani, the editor-in-chief of Evidence-Based Mental Health in Oxford, and I'm Michael Ostacher at Stanford University. I do want to remind people that we will be posting on our Twitter account and on our website the link to where all these YouTube Hangouts are archived. You're able to watch them at your leisure there. Please do interact with us on social media and use the hashtag EBMHchat. Thank you again for joining us. And thank you for Andre and the Mental Elf for helping promote this.